"You missed a spot, servant girl. The stones won't clean themselves with your pathetic scrubbing." The words cut through Lyra like shattered glass, each syllable designed to remind her exactly where she belonged in the world. She felt them settle into the familiar ache in her chest, the place where hope had once lived before she learned better. Lady Cordelia's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned her right to inflict pain on those beneath her, and Lyra was so far beneath her that she might as well have been invisible. Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the blood-stained arena stones, her knuckles white around the scrub brush as she worked to remove the evidence of yesterday's combat trials. The ceremonial arena had seen 3 days of territorial challenges, and each victory had been painted in blood across the ancient granite. Her hands were raw from the lye soap, her back screaming from hours bent over the stones, but she didn't dare pause. Not today. Not when the entire Northern Territories had gathered for the most important ceremony in a generation, the bonding ceremony, the ritual that would determine not just the next Luna of the most powerful pack in the continent, but the political alliances that would shape the future of 7 territories. Today, Alpha King Theron's ancient war beast would choose his mate, and that choice would elevate one woman to unimaginable power while crushing the hopes of every other noble female who dared to dream. The sun's already climbing, and you're still on your hands and knees like the worthless thing you are. Lady Cordelia's silk slippers appeared in Lyra's peripheral vision, close enough that one wrong move would earn her a kick. Perhaps if you spent less time daydreaming and more time working, you might actually be useful for something. Lyra bit back the words that wanted to spill from her lips, the defiance that still flickered somewhere deep inside, despite 20 years of learning to swallow it. She had learned that speaking only made things worse, that the safest path was to become so small, so invisible, that she barely existed at all. It had kept her alive this long. It would keep her alive through today. The arena filled steadily around her as the morning progressed, a sea of silk and silver and political ambition. She caught glimpses of the visiting alphas from her position near the stones, massive men with scarred hands and eyes that missed nothing, their presence alone enough to make the air shimmer with barely contained violence. They had come from as far as the eastern cliffs and the southern marshlands, drawn by the promise of witnessing history unfold, because Alpha King Theron's war beast had never chosen a mate. Fenris was legend made flesh, a creature of such supernatural power that songs were written about his victories in battle. He had fought beside the Alpha King for 15 years, had torn through enemy packs like they were made of paper, had single-handedly ended 3 territorial wars through sheer devastating force. But he had never shown interest in the political ceremonies that determined pack hierarchies, until now. The mystics claimed it was time, that Fenris had reached the age where his supernatural instincts would demand a mate, and whichever female he chose would become not just Luna, but the mother of the most powerful bloodline the Northern Territories had ever known. The political ramifications were staggering. The lucky woman's family would rise to unprecedented influence, their territorial claims secured for generations. Lyra understood why Lady Seraphina looked so confident as she held court near the ceremonial circle's centre. She was everything a Luna should be, golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, emerald eyes that could command or seduce with equal skill, a body that moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had never doubted her own worth. Her family controlled the richest mining territories in the east, and her betrothal to Alpha King Theron had been negotiated since childhood. She was perfect. She was chosen. She was everything Lyra would never be. "Move yourself, girl. The nobles need clear sightlines for the ceremony." The head servant's sharp elbow caught Lyra's ribs as she hauled herself to her feet, her cleaning supplies clutched against her chest like armour. Around her, the arena had transformed into something magnificent and terrible, silver banners snapping in the morning breeze, ceremonial torches burning despite the daylight, the the ancient summoning circle marked in symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Lyra found herself pushed toward the farthest corner of the arena, pressed against the stone wall with the other servants and lesser pack members. From here she could see everything but participate in nothing. It was perfect invisibility, the kind she had mastered over 2 decades of learning to survive. The crowd fell silent as Power approached. She felt him before she saw him, a presence that made every instinct she had learned to suppress suddenly roar to life. Her wolf, the creature she had spent years teaching to lie dormant, stirred with painful intensity as Alpha King Theron entered the ceremonial arena. The ache that always lived in her chest sharpened to something that felt like recognition, like longing, like a wound that had been waiting 20 years to heal. He moved through the assembled crowd like violence barely leashed, his massive frame cutting through space with predatory grace that made even the visiting alphas step aside. His midnight black hair caught the torchlight, and when his silver eyes swept the arena, Lyra felt the foolish urge to drop to her knees in submission. This was what power looked like when it wore flesh, absolute, uncompromising, devastating in its certainty. The scars that mapped his chest and arms told stories of battles won through brutal efficiency, and every line of his body spoke of a man who had never lost, never compromised, never shown mercy to those who challenged him. He had united the Northern Territories through conquest and fear, had forged an empire from warring factions through sheer force of will and supernatural strength. And today his war beast would choose the woman who would stand beside him as he ruled. The ancient summoning chants began, voices raised in the old tongue that predated written history. Lyra felt the words in her bones, a resonance that made her wolf pace restlessly inside her chest. The ceremonial circle began to glow with silver light as the mystics called to the sacred forest, calling Fenris home to make his choice. Lady Seraphina positioned herself at the circle's heart, radiant in cloth of gold that made her look like a goddess descended to earth. The other noble females arranged themselves hopefully around the circle's perimeter, each one beautiful, each one politically valuable, each one infinitely more worthy than a servant girl pressed against the arena's farthest wall. The ground began to tremble. Lyra's breath caught as an ancient howl rose from the forest beyond the arena, a sound that silenced every other voice and made the torches flicker in their holders. This was not the call of any ordinary wolf. This was the voice of legend, of nightmare, of power that had walked the earth since the old magic was young. Fenris was coming. The war beast's massive form emerged from the tree line like a creature from the oldest stories, silver-white fur gleaming in the morning light, eyes like molten gold that seemed to hold the wisdom and wildness of centuries. He was the size of a small horse, his presence filling the arena with supernatural energy that made the ceremonial symbols burn brighter and the assembled crowd hold its collective breath. He surveyed the noble females with predatory intelligence, his golden gaze moving from face to face as if reading secrets written in their souls. This was the moment that would reshape the political landscape of 7 territories, the choice that would elevate one woman to unprecedented power while crushing the dreams of all the others. Lady Seraphina lifted her chin proudly, her emerald eyes meeting Fenris's golden stare with confident expectation. She was ready. She was chosen. She was perfect. The war beast's massive head turned slowly away from her, his nostrils flaring as he scented something that made his entire body go still with sudden, focused attention. Something impossible was about to happen. The recognition ceremony began at the stroke of midnight, when Luna reached her full strength and ancient magic stirred in response to the celestial alignment that occurred only once each moon cycle. The sacred grove beyond the palace walls had been transformed into something that belonged more to legend than reality, silver torches casting dancing shadows between trees older than written memory, while mystics in ceremonial robes chanted invocations in the forgotten tongue. Lyra stood at the grove's heart, draped in white silk that seemed to glow with its own inner light under the moon's blessed radiance. Every noble family in 7 territories had gathered to witness this moment, some drawn by curiosity, others by political necessity, all of them united in their desperate need to understand how a servant girl had upended their carefully ordered world. Elder Morrigan approached with the ritual implements that would either prove royal bloodline or destroy the pretender who dared claim such heritage. The ceremonial blade gleamed with silver that had been blessed under 100 full moons, its edge sharp enough to draw the sacred blood required for the ancient magic to judge truth from deception. "Are you prepared, child?" Morrigan's blind eyes seemed to peer directly into Lyra's soul as she offered the blade with hands steady despite their age. "The magic will strip away every concealment, every barrier that has hidden your true nature. There will be nowhere to hide from what you truly are." Lyra's fingers trembled as she accepted the blade, its silver surface warm against her palm despite the chill night air. Around the grove's perimeter she could see Theron standing with Fenris at his side, both of them radiating the kind of protective tension that spoke of readiness to intervene if the ceremony went wrong. The mate bond hummed between her and the Alpha King like a golden lifeline, carrying his strength when her own threatened to falter. "I'm ready," she said, and was surprised to discover that she meant it. 20 years of questions were about to be answered, 20 years of wondering why she felt different, why she ached with longing for things she couldn't name, why her dreams were filled with silver light and voices speaking of destinies she didn't understand. The first cut across her palm sent drops of blood sizzling against the ancient stones, carved with symbols that predated the written word. But instead of the crimson flow expected from mortal veins, silver light began to seep from the wound, not just reflecting the moonlight, but generating its own radiance that made the assembled nobles gasp in recognition of power that couldn't be faked or manufactured. "Royal blood," someone whispered from the crowd, the words carrying like wildfire through the gathered witnesses. True royal blood burns silver in the moonlight. But Elder Morrigan wasn't finished with her examination. The ancient mystic began tracing patterns in the air above Lyra's bleeding palm, her fingers weaving supernatural forces that made the very air shimmer with barely contained energy. The silver light responding to her ministrations grew brighter, more intense, until it illuminated the entire grove with radiance that turned midnight into something approaching dawn. "Show us the mark," Morrigan commanded, her voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "Show us the birthright that proves your claim beyond any doubt." Lyra's left shoulder began to burn with supernatural fire as the suppression magic that had hidden her true nature for 20 years finally crumbled completely. The sensation was agony and ecstasy combined, pain that felt like liberation as ancient power reclaimed what had always belonged to it. She pulled aside the white silk covering her shoulder, exposing skin that began to glow with inner light. The crescent moon birthmark appeared slowly, silver lines etching themselves across her flesh with the deliberate precision of magic that had waited 2 decades to reveal itself. The symbol pulsed with each heartbeat, growing brighter and more defined until every person in the grove could see the mark that had been recorded in royal genealogies for 3 centuries. The sign of true sovereignty that no amount of political manoeuvring could counterfeit. The crowd erupted into chaos as the impossible became undeniably real. This was Princess Lysandra, the lost heir who everyone had believed died in the flames that consumed the royal wing 20 years ago. The rightful queen of the Northern Territories, whose bloodline carried magic pure enough to bend reality itself to her will. Lady Seraphina's scream of fury cut through the celebratory noise like breaking glass. "This is impossible! She's nothing! She's been a servant her entire life!" But her protests fell on deaf ears, as nobles who had dismissed Lyra as worthless only days before now rushed forward to pledge their loyalty to the returned princess. The political landscape shifted like sand as families recalculated their alliances, their territorial ambitions, their very survival based on this revelation that changed everything. Through it all, Lyra stood frozen in the centre of the supernatural storm she had unleashed, silver light cascading from her skin as 20 years of suppressed magic finally found its voice. She could feel the power flowing through her veins like liquid starlight, filling spaces in her soul that had ached with emptiness her entire life. "My queen," Theron's voice carried across the grove with absolute certainty, cutting through the chaos as he approached, with Fenris padding silently at his side. When he reached the ceremonial circle, he did something that sent shockwaves through every witness present. The Alpha King, conqueror of 7 territories, dropped to one knee before the girl who had once scrubbed blood from his arena stones. "My queen," he repeated, his silver eyes blazing with pride and possessive certainty as he offered her the kind of respect that redefined power itself. "Command me." The words hit Lyra like physical force, not just because of their formal acknowledgement of her royal status, but because of the emotions that blazed through their mate bond, reverence and desire, and a love so fierce it took her breath away. He wasn't kneeling out of political necessity or social obligation. He was choosing to submit to her authority because she was his mate, his equal, his destined partner in ruling the empire he had built. One by one, the nobles followed his example until the entire grove was filled with bowed heads and pledged loyalty. The lost princess had returned, the rightful heir had reclaimed her throne, and the northern territories had their queen at last. But as Lyra looked out over the sea of submission that surrounded her, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not just the power of royal bloodline magic, but the confidence that came from finally understanding her own worth. She was no longer the invisible servant who cleaned up after others. She was the queen these people needed, the ruler who would protect them from the enemies that had destroyed her family and threatened to tear apart everything her bloodline had built. "Rise!" she commanded, her voice carrying supernatural authority that made even the ancient trees seem to lean closer in acknowledgement. "Rise and know that your loyalty will be rewarded, your service honoured, and your territories protected under the crown that is mine by right of birth and magic, and the bonds that can never be broken." The silver light that poured from her skin as she spoke seemed to bless every person present, marking them as subjects of a queen who had learned compassion through suffering, wisdom through loss, strength through the kind of trials that forge legends from ordinary souls. Princess Lysandra was dead. She had died 20 years ago in flames and treachery and the screams of a family torn apart by political ambition. What stood in her place was something new, something forged in the crucible of servitude and awakened in the fires of supernatural recognition. Queen Lyra had come home to claim her throne, and she would never be powerless again. The challenge came at dawn, delivered with the formal precision required by ancient law and the desperate fury of a woman who had watched her entire world crumble in a single night. Lady Seraphina stood in the centre of the ceremonial arena, wearing battle leathers that transformed her from elegant noble into something far more dangerous, her emerald eyes blazing with the kind of hatred that started wars and ended bloodlines. "I invoke the right of trial by combat." Her voice rang across the arena where nobles had gathered to witness what might be the final act of a drama that had reshaped 7 territories. "I challenge the pretender's claim to throne and mate, as is my right under laws older than any crown." Lyra felt ice flood her veins as she looked down from the royal viewing platform. Her newly awakened queen's regalia, suddenly feeling like armor that would provide no protection against the woman whose life she had inadvertently destroyed. Seraphina had been trained in warfare from childhood, had studied under masters who taught the deadly arts to noble daughters, expected to defend their territories through blade and blood. She was everything a warrior should be, fierce, skilled, utterly without mercy for those who stood between her and what she desired. "You don't have to accept," Theron said quietly, his silver eyes dark with protective fury as he studied the woman who had dared challenge his mate's authority. "Ancient law gives you the right to name a champion I could fight in your place." But even as he made the offer, they both knew it would solve nothing. A champion's victory would always carry whispers of weakness, suggestions that the Queen could not defend her own claim to power. And Seraphina's challenge wasn't just about the throne. It was about Theron himself, about the mate bond that had stolen the future she had been promised since birth. "She wants to face me personally," Lyra said, understanding flooding through her as she watched Seraphina's predatory stance in the arena below. "This isn't about law or legitimacy. This is about revenge." Fenris's protective growl rumbled from where he had positioned himself at the platform's edge, his golden eyes fixed on the woman who threatened his chosen charge with lethal intensity. But ancient law bound even the legendary guardian. Trial by combat was sacred, inviolate, a test that must be faced without interference from supernatural protectors or devoted mates. "I accept the challenge," Lyra called down to the arena, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with authority that still felt strange on her tongue. The words sent murmurs rippling through the nobles who had expected a different response, who had perhaps hoped their new queen would show wisdom by avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. But they didn't understand what 20 years of survival had taught her. Sometimes the only way through danger was to face it directly, to meet violence with strength, and refuse to let fear make the choices that would define the rest of your life. The preparation chamber beneath the arena felt like a tomb, as servants helped Lyra into battle leathers that had been hastily modified to fit her frame. The weapons master who attended her moved with the careful respect due to royalty, but she could see doubt in his eyes as he evaluated her chances against an opponent who had trained for this moment her entire life. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "Lady Seraphina is formidable. She has studied under the finest blade masters, has killed in territorial disputes, has never lost a formal combat. Perhaps if you focused on defence, on surviving long enough for her to make a mistake." "No," Lyra said with certainty that surprised them both. "I won't win this fight by hiding or hoping for mercy. If I'm going to prove my worth as queen, it has to be through strength." But even as she spoke the brave words, terror clawed at her chest with icy fingers. What did she know of combat beyond the defensive skills that had kept her alive in the servants' quarters? How could 20 years of scrubbing floors prepare her to face someone who had been bred for warfare? The answer came as she touched the ceremonial blade at her side. Silver fire cascaded through her veins, royal bloodline magic responding to mortal danger with power that had been suppressed but never truly dormant. The same force that had painted her chamber walls with light during the assassination attempt, that had burned away 20 years of concealment during the recognition ceremony, now stirred in preparation for battle. She was not just Lyra the servant anymore. She was Queen Lyra, heir to 3 centuries of rulers whose supernatural strength had carved an empire from wilderness and chaos. That power lived in her blood, in her bones, in the silver light that danced behind her eyes when her royal heritage awakened to defend itself. The arena floor felt different beneath her feet as she emerged to face Seraphina. Not the cold stones she had once scrubbed clean of blood, but sacred ground where queens proved their worth through trial by combat. The crowd's roar seemed distant, unimportant compared to the golden warmth of the mate bond connecting her to Theron, whose emotions blazed through their connection with pride and terror, an absolute faith in her ability to survive whatever came next. You stole everything from me, Seraphina snarled as they circled each other with predatory grace, her blade gleaming in the morning sunlight. My throne, my mate, my future, all taken by a servant pretending to royal blood. I stole nothing, Lyra replied, her own weapon steady in her hand, despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. I simply reclaimed what was always mine. The first clash of steel rang across the arena like a bell, and Lyra discovered that royal bloodline magic came with gifts she hadn't expected. Her reflexes were sharper than they should have been, her strength enhanced by power that flowed through supernatural heritage. Her awareness expanded until she could track Seraphina's movements with clarity that bordered on prescience. But experience still mattered, and Seraphina had decades of training that no amount of awakened magic could instantly overcome. Her attacks came with brutal efficiency, each strike designed to end the fight quickly before her opponent's supernatural advantages could fully manifest. Steel sang against steel as they danced the deadly ballet of formal combat, neither giving ground, both understanding that this was about more than political power or mating rights. This was about proving which vision of strength would define their world. The old order built on birth and training and careful cultivation of advantage, or the new reality where worth could emerge from the most unlikely sources and reshape everything through sheer force of will. The crowd held its breath as silver light began to emanate from Lyra's skin, royal magic responding to mortal danger with protective fire that transformed her from challenger into force of nature. This was what her bloodline was capable of when fully awakened, what her ancestors had wielded to build and defend an empire that had endured for centuries. Seraphina's emerald eyes widened with shock and growing desperation as she realized her opponent was becoming something beyond conventional combat skills. But desperation made her dangerous, reckless, willing to risk everything on attacks that could either end the fight or destroy them both. The final exchange came suddenly, inevitably, two women pouring everything they possessed into strikes that would determine the fate of 7 territories. Steel met silver light in a collision that shook the very foundations of the arena, and when the brilliance faded, only one fighter remained standing. Queen Lyra stood over her defeated challenger, royal power still crackling around her like captured lightning, victorious not through luck or mercy, but through the strength that had always lived in her blood, waiting for the moment when survival demanded she embrace what she truly was. The servant who had once cleaned these stones was gone forever. What remained was a queen who had proven her worth in the crucible of combat, ready to rule an empire with the strength of her ancestors and the wisdom earned through 20 years of learning that true power came not from birth, but from the choices made when everything was at stake. 6 months after the trial by combat that had secured her throne, Queen Lyra stood on the highest balcony of the royal palace and watched the sun set over territories that had finally found peace under her rule. The crown that rested on her silver hair no longer felt like a foreign weight. It had become part of her, as natural as breathing, as essential as the mate bond that connected her heart to the man who ruled beside her. The coronation ceremony had been magnificent beyond anything the Northern Territories had witnessed in living memory. 7 kingdoms had sent representatives to witness the lost princess reclaim her birthright, their gifts and pledges of alliance creating bonds that would ensure prosperity for generations to come. But it was the quiet moments afterward that had truly mattered, the private ceremony where she and Theron had spoken vows before ancient magic and sealed their mate bond with promises that transcended political necessity. "You're thinking too loudly," Theron's voice carried warmth and amusement as he approached from behind, his arms encircling her waist with the possessive tenderness that still made her heart race after months of marriage. Through their bond, she could feel his contentment, his deep satisfaction with the life they had built together from the ashes of impossible circumstances. "I was thinking about before," she admitted, leaning back against his chest as they watched the last rays of sunlight paint the ceremonial gardens in gold and crimson. About the girl who used to scrub these stones, who thought she was nothing, who couldn't imagine ever belonging anywhere that mattered. Theron's hold on her tightened, his emotions flowing through their connection with protective fury that still flared whenever he remembered how close the world had come to losing her. That girl had strength the rest of us couldn't see. She survived 20 years of believing herself worthless while carrying the power of queens in her blood. Everything she endured made her into the ruler our people needed. Below them in the gardens, Fenris padded along the pathways with the satisfied pace of a guardian whose sacred duty had been fulfilled beyond his wildest hopes. The ancient war beast had adapted to peacetime with surprising grace, though he still positioned himself protectively whenever crowds gathered around his chosen queen. Some bonds, Lyra had learned, transcended circumstance and endured, regardless of whether protection was needed. "The pregnancy is progressing well," she said softly, her hand moving to rest over the slight curve of her abdomen where new life grew with each passing day. "The royal physicians say the child carries strong magical signatures, another heir to continue the bloodline." Theron's joy blazed through their mate bond like sunrise, warm and golden and utterly complete. The knowledge that they would have a child, that the royal line would continue through love rather than political arrangement, felt like the universe's final blessing on choices that had once seemed impossible. "Boy or girl?" he asked, though they both knew the question was merely ritual. Royal children revealed their nature when they were ready, usually during the first months of life when supernatural heritage began to manifest. "Does it matter?" Lyra smiled as she turned in his arms, her grey eyes bright with the kind of happiness she had never imagined herself capable of feeling. "Our child will grow up knowing they are loved, knowing they belong, knowing their worth isn't determined by what others choose to see in them." The words carried weight that went beyond simple parenting philosophy. Their child would never know the crushing invisibility that had defined Lyra's early years, would never question their place in the world or their right to claim the power that lived in their blood. Love and acceptance would be their birthright, as fundamental as the magical heritage that flowed through royal veins. A soft knock at the balcony door interrupted their private moment, and Lyra smiled as she recognised the respectful pattern that announced Elder Morrigan's presence. The ancient mystic had become an unofficial advisor to the crown, her wisdom helping guide political decisions that affected territories stretching from the eastern cliffs to the western plains. "Enter, Elder," Lyra called, her voice carrying the natural authority that had developed over months of learning to rule with both strength and compassion. Morrigan approached with careful steps, her blind eyes bright with the kind of satisfaction that came from witnessing prophecies fulfilled in ways that exceeded even mystical expectations. "Your Majesties, I bring news from the border territories. The families who supported Seraphina's faction have formally requested pardons, acknowledging your reign and pledging renewed loyalty to the crown." The news was significant, the last holdout factions finally accepting what had been inevitable since the moment Fenris first bowed before a servant girl in the ceremonial arena. Lyra felt a deep sense of completion flow through her, the knowledge that her kingdom was finally united under leadership that had been tested in every way that mattered. "Grant the pardons," she decided without hesitation, "but make it clear that mercy comes with conditions. Their territories will be monitored, their actions scrutinised, and any hint of renewed rebellion will be met with the full power of the crown." "As you wish, Your Majesty." Morrigan's approval radiated through her ancient features as she bowed with respect that had been earned through strength and wisdom, rather than demanded through birthright alone. As the elder withdrew to carry out her queen's will, Lyra and Theron returned to their contemplation of the territories spread out below them, lands that had finally found stability under rulers who understood that true strength came from protecting rather than dominating, from lifting up rather than crushing down. "Do you ever wonder," Lyra mused, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, What would have happened if Fenris hadn't recognized me? If the suppression magic had held for another few years? Theron's answer came without hesitation, blazing through their mate bond with absolute certainty. I would have found you anyway. Maybe not that day, maybe not in that arena, but the bond was always there, waiting. Ancient magic doesn't make mistakes about souls that belong together. The truth of his words settled over her like a blessing, the understanding that their love story had been written in forces older than kingdoms, or crowns, or political convenience. They had found each other despite every obstacle, had chosen each other despite every reason they shouldn't, and had built something beautiful from the ashes of impossible circumstances. "I love you," she whispered against his lips as he leaned down to kiss her, the words carrying weight that encompassed not just romantic devotion, but gratitude for the man who had seen worth in her when she couldn't see it in herself. "And I love you," he replied, his silver eyes blazing with the kind of fierce devotion that had redefined what it meant to be an alpha king. "My queen, my mate, my heart." Below them, the kingdom settled into peaceful slumber under the protection of rulers who had learned that true power came not from commanding others, but from inspiring them to be better than they thought possible. The servant girl who had once cleaned blood from stones was gone, replaced by a queen who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that no child in her territories would ever have to learn their worth through suffering. The lost princess had come home at last, and she would never be powerless again. The Alpha King stepped into the ceremonial circle with the fluid grace of a predator claiming territory that had always belonged to him. Lyra felt her breath catch as his presence filled the arena, a weight of authority so absolute that even the visiting alphas straightened in their seats with unconscious deference. This was what legends looked like when they walked among mortals, devastating in their certainty, beautiful in their terrible power. His midnight black hair fell across his forehead in waves that caught the torchlight, and when he moved, the scars that mapped his chest and arms shifted like a living tapestry of violence survived and enemies conquered. Each mark told a story of battles won through brutal efficiency, of challenges met with overwhelming force, of a man who had never known defeat because defeat was simply not a concept his world allowed. But it was his eyes that stole Lyra's ability to think clearly. Silver like moonlight on water, they swept the assembled crowd with predatory intelligence that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the secrets hidden beneath. When his gaze passed over her corner of the arena, she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, terrified that somehow those ancient eyes would find her among the other invisible servants and see something she didn't even know was there to be seen. The ceremonial chants rose around him as he took his position at the summoning circle's northern point, his deep voice joining the ancient words that called to the sacred forest beyond. The old tongue rolled off his lips like he had been born speaking it, each syllable resonating with power that made the ceremonial symbols carved into the arena stones pulse with inner light. This was magic older than written history, the ritual binding that connected Alpha to Guardian, ruler to the supernatural forces that kept the balance of the world. "Fenris, keeper of the ancient ways, guardian of the bloodline, answer your Alpha's call." Theron's voice carried across the arena like thunder, commanding and absolute. "Come home and choose the one who will stand beside us as we rule." The ground trembled beneath their feet as something vast and ancient stirred in the forest depths. Lyra felt her wolf respond with painful intensity, a recognition that made no sense but felt more real than her own heartbeat. Her chest ached with longing she couldn't name, a pull towards something she had never been allowed to want. Around the ceremonial circle, the noble females arranged themselves like flowers in a garden of political ambition. Lady Seraphina commanded the centre position, her cloth of gold gown catching the torchlight until she seemed to glow with her own radiance. Her emerald eyes sparkled with confident anticipation as she lifted her chin proudly, every line of her perfect body declaring her readiness to claim the power that had been promised to her since birth. Beside her, Lady Vivian from the Western Plains stood poised in midnight blue silk, her auburn hair braided with silver threads that spoke of her family's mining wealth. Lady Isabel from the southern marshlands wore deep forest green that complemented her dark beauty, while Lady Morgana from the eastern cliffs had chosen crimson that made her pale skin look like carved marble. Each woman was magnificent in her own right, each one carrying the weight of territorial alliances and political necessity, each one infinitely more worthy than a servant girl who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. The howl that rose from the forest made every other sound in the arena die away to nothing. It was not the call of any ordinary creature. This was the voice of legend made flesh, of power that had walked the earth since the old magic was young. The sound vibrated through Lyra's bones like recognition, like homecoming, like a wound that had been waiting 20 years to heal. Her wolf stirred with desperate intensity, responding to something in that ancient call that her human mind couldn't comprehend, but her soul knew with devastating certainty. Fenris emerged from the tree line like a creature from the oldest stories, and Lyra felt her world tilt on its axis as she looked upon him for the first time. He was massive beyond belief, silver-white fur gleaming in the morning light like captured moonbeams, eyes like molten gold that held the wisdom and wildness of centuries. His shoulders stood level with a tall man's chest, his paws the size of dinner plates, his presence filling the arena with supernatural energy that made the air itself shimmer with barely contained power. This was the war beast that had ended 3 territorial conflicts through sheer devastating force, the guardian whose loyalty to Alpha King Theron had become the foundation of an empire. The assembled crowd held its collective breath as Fenris padded into the ceremonial circle with predatory grace, his golden eyes moving systematically from face to face. This was the moment that would reshape the political landscape of 7 territories, the choice that would elevate one woman to unprecedented influence while crushing the dreams of all the others. He approached Lady Seraphina first, his massive head lowering as he inhaled her scent with deliberate consideration. She stood perfectly still, her emerald eyes bright with triumph as the war beast examined her. This was what she had been born for, what every lesson in politics and protocol had prepared her to claim. The betrothal contracts with Alpha King Theron were already signed, the territorial agreements already negotiated. Fenris's choice would simply make official what had been decided in council chambers years ago. But the ancient creature's golden eyes showed no flicker of recognition, no spark of the supernatural bond that would mark his chosen mate. He moved to Lady Vivian with the same methodical attention, then Lady Isabel, then Lady Morgana. Each examination was thorough, respectful, utterly devoid of the mystical connection the ceremony was designed to reveal. Confusion rippled through the assembled nobles as Fenris systematically rejected every woman who had dared to dream of standing beside the Alpha King. Murmurs began to rise from the crowd, whispered questions about what could possibly be wrong. These were the finest daughters of the most powerful families in 7 territories. These were women bred for leadership, trained in politics, prepared from birth to carry the weight of supernatural power. If Fenris couldn't choose from among them, then who? The war beast's massive head lifted suddenly, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made his entire body go still with focused attention. His golden eyes began to move past the ceremonial circle, past the assembled nobles, past the carefully arranged hierarchy of political power, toward the corner where the servants waited in invisible silence. Lyra felt ice flood her veins as that ancient gaze began to sweep the shadows where she hid, searching for something that made his supernatural senses sing with recognition. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. She was nobody, nothing. A servant girl who cleaned blood from stones and learned to survive by never drawing attention to herself. The war beast took a step away from the ceremonial circle, away from the noble females who represented everything he should want, everything that made political sense. Another step toward the servants' corner, toward the shadows where Lyra pressed herself against the stone wall like she could become part of the arena itself. Alpha King Theron's sharp voice cut through the growing murmurs of confusion. "Fenris, return to the circle and make your choice." The command carried absolute authority, the kind of alpha dominance that brooked no defiance from any creature under his rule. For 15 years, Fenris had never disobeyed a direct order. For 15 years, his loyalty had been absolute, unwavering, the foundation upon which an empire had been built. The war beast ignored his alpha's command completely, his golden eyes locked on something in the servants' shadows with laser focus. The crowd's confused murmurs died away to horrified silence as the impossible unfolded before them. Fenris, the most loyal guardian in the history of the Northern Territories, had just defied Alpha King Theron's direct command for something hidden among the invisible servants. Lady Seraphina's voice rose in shocked outrage, her perfect composure finally cracking. "What is that creature doing? This is not how the ceremony proceeds." But Fenris was already moving with deliberate purpose toward the corner where Lyra cowered against the stone wall, his massive paws carrying him away from everything that made sense, everything that followed the established order of the world, away from political necessity and towards something that called to the ancient magic in his blood with undeniable truth. Fenris approached Lady Seraphina with the methodical precision of a predator evaluating prey, his massive head lowering until his golden eyes were level with hers. She stood perfectly still in her cloth of gold gown, emerald eyes bright with confident anticipation, as the war beast inhaled her scent with deliberate consideration. This was the moment she had been born for, trained for, promised since childhood when the betrothal contracts were first negotiated in council chambers thick with political necessity. But something was wrong. The ancient creature's nostrils flared once, twice, his golden gaze moving across her face with the same detached assessment he might give to a stranger encountered on a forest path. There was no recognition, no spark of the supernatural bond that would mark his chosen mate, no flicker of the mystical connection that songs were written about and kingdoms built upon. Fenris stepped away from her without ceremony, leaving Lady Seraphina frozen in place with shock beginning to crack her perfect composure. The war beast moved to Lady Vivian with the same deliberate attention, his massive frame dwarfing her midnight blue silk as he examined her with supernatural senses that saw far beyond mortal understanding. She trembled slightly under his scrutiny, hope and terror warring in her auburn-haired beauty as she waited for the bond that would elevate her family's mining wealth to unimaginable political power. Nothing. The same empty assessment, the same absence of recognition that had marked his encounter with Seraphina. Lady Isabel received the same thorough, respectful, utterly devoid examination. Then Lady Morgana. Then the lesser nobles who had arranged themselves hopefully around the ceremonial circle's perimeter, each one representing territorial alliances and political agreements that stretched back generations. Confusion rippled through the assembled crowd like wind through wheat as Fenris systematically rejected every woman who had dared to dream of standing beside Alpha King Theron. These were the finest daughters of the most powerful families in 7 territories, women bred for leadership and trained in the delicate art of supernatural politics. If the ancient guardian couldn't find his mate among them, then where? Fenris's massive head lifted suddenly, his entire body going still with the focused intensity of a hunter who had caught an unexpected scent. His golden eyes began to move past the ceremonial circle, past the carefully arranged hierarchy of political power, past everything that made sense according to the established order of their world. His nostrils flared again, wider this time, drinking in something that made his supernatural senses sing with recognition. The scent trail led away from the noble females, away from the ceremonial centre where power was supposed to reside, toward the shadows where the invisible servants waited in practised silence. Toward the corner where Lyra pressed herself against the stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs as those ancient golden eyes began their impossible search. This couldn't be happening. This was some mistake, some cruel twist of fate that would end in her destruction when the truth of her presumption was revealed. She was nobody, nothing, a servant girl who cleaned blood from stones and survived by learning to disappear completely. Whatever Fenris was seeking, it couldn't be her. But the war beast took a deliberate step away from the ceremonial circle, away from Lady Seraphina's shocked face and the political necessity she represented. Another step toward the servants' corner, his massive paws carrying him with predatory purpose toward something that called to the ancient magic in his blood. Alpha King. Theron's voice cut through the arena like a blade, sharp with the kind of authority that had forged an empire from warring territories. Fenris, return to the circle and make your choice. The command rolled across the assembled crowd with supernatural force, alpha dominance so absolute that even the visiting alphas felt the urge to bare their throats in submission. For 15 years that voice had been law to the ancient guardian. For 15 years Fenris had never disobeyed, never hesitated, never questioned the will of the man who had saved him from madness and given him purpose. The war beast didn't even pause. His golden eyes remained locked on the servant's shadows as he continued his impossible approach, defying his alpha's direct command for the first time in their legendary partnership. The crowd's confused murmurs died away to horrified silence as they witnessed something that shattered every assumption about loyalty and supernatural bonds. Lady Seraphina's perfect composure finally cracked completely. "What is that creature doing?" Her voice rose with shocked outrage, emerald eyes blazing with fury as she watched her destined coronation dissolve into chaos. "This is not how the ceremony proceeds. This is not what was promised." But Fenris was deaf to her protests, blind to the political catastrophe unfolding in his wake. His massive frame moved with inevitable purpose toward the corner where Lyra cowered, each step carrying him further from everything that made sense and closer to something that sang in his blood like homecoming. The servants around her scrambled backward in terror, abandoning their invisible companion to face whatever supernatural judgment was approaching. Lyra found herself utterly alone against the stone wall, exposed and trembling as the most legendary creature in 7 territories stalked toward her with focused intensity. Her wolf writhed inside her chest, responding to Fenris's approach with desperate recognition that her human mind couldn't comprehend. The ache that had lived in her bones for 20 years sharpened to something that felt like completion, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Fenris reached the edge of the servants' area and stopped, his golden eyes finding hers across the few remaining feet of space that separated them. In that moment, Lyra felt the world narrow to a single point of impossible connection. Ancient magic recognizing ancient magic despite every barrier that had been built to keep them apart. The war beast's massive head lowered slowly, deliberately, until his golden gaze was level with her terrified grey eyes. And then, while the entire Northern Territories watched in stunned disbelief, Fenris, the most powerful guardian in living memory, the creature whose loyalty had never wavered, bowed his great head before a servant girl who had spent her life learning to be invisible. The gesture was unmistakable, sacred, undeniable. The arena erupted into chaos as nobles leaped to their feet, their voices raised in shock and outrage and desperate confusion. This was impossible. This violated every law of supernatural hierarchy, every principle of political order, every assumption about worth and bloodline and destiny that their world had been built upon. Lady Seraphina's scream of fury cut through the cacophony like breaking glass. "This is witchcraft! Sorcery! That creature has been bewitched!" But her accusations fell on deaf ears as every eye in the arena focused on the tableau that defied comprehension. The ancient guardian submitting to a servant, power bowing before powerlessness, legend kneeling at the feet of someone who wasn't supposed to exist in their carefully ordered world. Lyra stared down at Fenris's bowed head in terror that felt like falling, like drowning, like waking up to discover that everything she had ever known about herself was a lie. His silver-white fur gleamed in the torchlight, close enough now that she could see the ancient wisdom in his golden eyes, could feel the supernatural power radiating from his massive frame like heat from a forge. This was the creature that had ended wars. This was the guardian whose strength had built an empire, and he had chosen her. The impossible had become undeniably, catastrophically real, and there was no taking it back. The roar that erupted from Alpha King Theron's throat was not entirely human. It rolled across the ceremonial arena like thunder given flesh, carrying with it the weight of absolute authority and supernatural rage that made every creature present, wolf and human alike, instinctively bare their throats in submission. The sound resonated in Lyra's bones, in her blood, in the deepest parts of her soul, where her suppressed wolf cowered in recognition of power that could crush her without thought. "Fenris, heal!" The command struck the air with physical force, alpha dominance so overwhelming that the torches flickered in their holders and the ceremonial stones beneath their feet seemed to tremble. This was the voice that had united 7 territories through conquest, that had brought warring packs to their knees, that had never, not once in 15 years, been disobeyed by the ancient guardian who had sworn loyalty unto death. But Fenris did not move. The war beast remained exactly where he was, his massive frame positioned protectively between Lyra and the world that sought to destroy her. His silver-white fur bristled with supernatural energy as he held his ground, golden eyes never wavering from his chosen charge. The sight was so impossible, so fundamentally wrong, according to every law of their hierarchical world, that several of the visiting alphas rose from their seats with hands moving instinctively toward weapons. Theron's fury escalated beyond anything Lyra had ever witnessed. His silver eyes blazed with the kind of rage that started wars, his massive frame radiating violence barely leashed as he stalked toward them with predatory intent. The scars mapping his chest and arms seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life, each mark a testament to enemies who had challenged him and learned too late the cost of defiance. "You will obey me," he snarled, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his thunderous roar. "You will return to the ceremonial circle. You will choose from among the noble females as decreed by ancient law and political necessity." For the first time in their legendary partnership, Fenris responded to his alpha's commands with open defiance. A low growl rumbled from his massive chest, not threatening but warning, the sound of a guardian who had found something worth protecting and would not be moved from his sacred duty. The crowd gasped in collective shock. Several of the more delicate noble ladies actually swooned, overcome by the impossible spectacle unfolding before them. This was Fenris, whose loyalty had become the stuff of legend, whose bond with the Alpha King was sung about in ballads throughout 7 territories. The foundation of their empire was built on that unwavering trust, that absolute unity between ruler and guardian, and it was cracking apart before their eyes. Lady Seraphina's voice cut through the stunned silence like breaking glass, her perfect composure completely shattered by the collapse of everything she had been promised since birth. "This is witchcraft! That servant has bewitched the beast with dark magic!" Her emerald eyes blazed with fury and desperate denial as she pointed an accusatory finger at Lyra. "She must be destroyed before her corruption spreads." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled nobles, their confusion seeking any explanation that didn't require them to accept the impossible. Witchcraft made sense. Sorcery could be understood, contained, eliminated. The alternative, that a servant girl might actually be worthy of the ancient guardian's recognition, was too dangerous to contemplate. Visiting alphas began to rise from their seats, their massive frames tense with the promise of violence. Lord Marcus from the eastern cliffs had his hand on his sword hilt, while Lord Garrett from the southern marshlands was already halfway to his feet. These were men who had built their power on the certainty of hierarchy, who could not allow the established order to crumble without fighting to preserve it. But as Theron continued his inexorable approach toward the impossible tableau, something shifted in the supernatural atmosphere of the arena. Lyra felt it first, a stirring in her chest, a warmth spreading through her bones that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Her wolf, the creature she had spent 20 years teaching to lie dormant, suddenly lifted its head with desperate hope. Because she could sense him now, could feel the barely controlled fury radiating from Alpha King Theron like heat from a forge. And beneath that rage, beneath the political necessity and wounded pride, she caught something else entirely. Something that made her breath catch and her heart stutter with impossible longing. He was beautiful in his anger, terrible and magnificent like a storm given human form. His midnight black hair fell across his forehead in waves that caught the torchlight, and when his silver eyes locked onto hers across the few remaining feet of space, Lyra felt her world shift on its axis completely. Those ancient eyes held secrets she didn't understand, power she couldn't comprehend, and something else, something that looked almost like recognition, like a question being asked that neither of them knew how to answer. Theron stopped mere inches from where Fenris stood guard, his massive frame towering over them both as he stared down at Lyra with lethal intensity. Up close, she could see the way his chest rose and fell with barely controlled breath, could smell the scent of leather and winter wind, and something indefinably wild that made her wolf pace restlessly inside her chest. "What are you?" The question was whispered with dangerous softness, each word carrying the weight of an empire's confusion. His silver gaze moved over her face like he was searching for answers written in her bones, solutions to a puzzle that threatened to destroy everything he had built. Lyra wanted to answer, wanted to explain that she was nobody, nothing, a servant who cleaned blood from stones and survived by learning to be invisible. But her voice seemed to have abandoned her completely, trapped somewhere between terror and a longing so fierce it felt like drowning. Fenris's protective growl deepened, his golden eyes never leaving Theron's face as he held his ground between Alpha and chosen charge. The message was unmistakable. He would not allow harm to come to the one he had recognized, not even from the man he had served faithfully for 15 years. The standoff stretched between them, three creatures locked in a moment that would either reshape their world or destroy it completely. Around them, the arena held its breath as nobles and alphas and servants alike waited to see which force would prove stronger, political necessity or supernatural truth, established order or ancient magic, the bonds of loyalty or the call of destiny that sang in blood older than written law. Theron's hand moved slowly toward the ceremonial blade at his side, his silver eyes never leaving Lyra's face as he weighed the cost of ending this impossible challenge to his authority. Fenris's muscles coiled in preparation to defend his chosen charge, even if it meant spilling the blood of the Alpha he had loved like a brother, and Lyra stood frozen between them, the invisible servant girl who had somehow become the centre of a conflict that would reshape 7 territories, understanding nothing except that the world was about to change forever, and she was powerless to stop it. The ancient voice that cut through the chaos carried the weight of centuries, weathered and wise and utterly unafraid of the violence crackling in the air around them. Elder Morrigan pushed through the crowd of panicking nobles with surprising strength for someone whose blind eyes had seen 90 winters, her gnarled staff tapping against the ceremonial stones with deliberate rhythm. "Stand down, young king." Her words were soft, but they seemed to fill the arena, commanding attention through sheer force of accumulated wisdom rather than supernatural dominance. "Violence will solve nothing here, and you know this." Theron's silver eyes blazed with barely restrained fury as he turned toward the mystic, his hand still hovering near the ceremonial blade that could end this impossible challenge to his authority. "Elder, this creature has been bewitched. Some dark magic compels my guardian to abandon his sacred duty." But Morrigan was already approaching the supernatural tableau with the fearless curiosity of someone who had spent decades studying forces beyond mortal understanding. Her blind eyes seemed to see more clearly than anyone else's as she moved toward where Fenris stood protectively over Lyra, her weathered hands extended as if tasting the very air for traces of ancient power. "May I?" She addressed the question to Fenris directly, treating the war beast as an equal participant in whatever ritual examination she intended to perform. The massive guardian considered her request with those intelligent golden eyes before stepping aside just enough to allow her approach, though his protective stance never fully relaxed. The crowd held its collective breath as Elder Morrigan knelt beside Lyra with surprising grace, her gnarled fingers hovering just above the trembling girl's skin as she began her mystical investigation. The air around them shimmered with barely visible energy as the mystic's supernatural senses probed for traces of manipulation, sorcery, any external force that might explain the impossible events unfolding before them. "No witchcraft," Morrigan announced after long moments of examination, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "No spells, no enchantments, no magic worked from without." She turned her blind gaze toward the assembled nobles, many of whom had been muttering accusations of dark arts. "This child is as free of external influence as any creature in this arena." Lady Seraphina's voice rose in desperate denial. "Then how do you explain this? This abomination? That beast was meant to choose from among the noble bloodlines, not some worthless servant girl." Elder Morrigan's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile as she placed one gnarled hand against Fenris's silver-white fur, the other reaching toward Lyra with infinite gentleness. "Because, child, the bloodline calls to its guardian. The wolf knows what the king has forgotten." The mystic's words sent ice flooding through Lyra's veins, even as they made her wolf stir with desperate recognition. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's restless murmuring. "I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I've always been nothing." "Have you, now?" Morrigan's blind eyes seemed to peer directly into Lyra's soul as her examination continued, supernatural senses reading truths written in bone and blood that mortal eyes could never perceive. "Tell me, child, do you remember your mother, your father, the circumstances of your birth?" The questions hit Lyra like physical blows, each one opening wounds she had learned to ignore through sheer necessity. The woman who raised me said my parents died in the border raids 20 years ago. She took me in out of pity, gave me work in the kitchens when I was old enough to be useful." 20 years ago. Elder Morrigan's voice carried a strange quality now, as if she was recalling events from a great distance. The year of the great betrayal, when treachery struck at the very heart of the royal bloodline and sent a kingdom into chaos. Theron's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the crowd's nervous whispers. His silver eyes narrowed with dangerous intensity as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began to fall into place. "Elder, you speak of events that are forbidden to—" "I speak of truth that has been buried too long," Morrigan interrupted with surprising firmness. truth that your guardian recognizes even when your rational mind rejects it. She turned toward Fenris, whose golden eyes were fixed on her with the kind of attention reserved for prophecy. "This is no ordinary war beast, young king. Fenris is bound by magic older than your empire, sworn to protect and serve the true royal bloodline of the Northern Territories." The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical force, gasps and exclamations erupting from nobles who had thought they understood the foundations of their world. Fenris was not just Theron's companion, he was a guardian whose loyalty ran deeper than personal affection, whose supernatural instincts were tied to bloodline magic that transcended political convenience. "The lost princess," someone whispered from the crowd, and Lyra felt her knees threaten to give way beneath her as impossible implications crashed over her like a tide. But she died in the coup. Everyone knows she died. Elder Morrigan's blind gaze never wavered from Lyra's face as she delivered the words that would shatter every assumption about identity and worth and destiny. Did she, or was she hidden away, her true nature suppressed by those who loved her enough to sacrifice everything to keep her safe? The mystic's gnarled fingers traced patterns in the air above Lyra's trembling form, and suddenly the arena was filled with the scent of ancient magic, moonlight and silver, and something wild that made every wolf present respond with instinctive recognition. The bloodline calls, and the guardian answers. This is not defiance. Young king, this is sacred law asserting itself despite decades of careful concealment. Lyra's world tilted completely off its axis as the implications of Morrigan's words sank into her consciousness. The lost princess, royal bloodline, sacred duty. Her entire life, the servitude, the invisibility, the careful lessons in survival, had all been built on a foundation of lies designed to protect a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. "This is impossible," she breathed. But even as she spoke the denial, her wolf was singing with recognition, with homecoming, with a rightness that felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place after 20 years of confusion. Theron's voice carried a strange quality when he finally spoke, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "The moon will reveal what the sun has hidden," he said, quoting an ancient prophecy that every child in the Northern Territories knew by heart. 3 nights hence, when Luna reaches her full strength." Elder Morrigan nodded with satisfaction, as if this was exactly the response she had been waiting for. The bloodline recognition ceremony, ancient magic that will prove what supernatural instinct has already revealed. She turned toward the assembled nobles with authority that brooked no argument. 3 days to prepare, 3 days for the truth to surface naturally, without force or violence or political manoeuvring. The crowd erupted into chaos as the implications sank in, the ceremony postponed, the political alliances thrown into question, the possibility that everything they thought they knew about power and hierarchy and worth was about to be overturned by ancient magic, and a servant girl who might be the rightful heir to a throne that had stood empty for 20 years. Through it all, Fenris never moved from his protective stance, his golden eyes watchful and alert as he guarded the one his supernatural instincts had recognized as worthy of his legendary loyalty. And despite the terror and confusion and impossible hope warring in her chest, Lyra found herself drawing strength from that ancient presence, from the knowledge that at least one creature in this chaotic world saw something in her worth protecting. The next 3 days would either prove her royal heritage or destroy her completely. But for the first time in her life, she was not facing that uncertainty alone. The chamber they escorted her to felt like stepping into someone else's dream. Lyra stood frozen in the doorway, her servant's instincts screaming that she didn't belong in a space so beautiful it made her chest ache with longing she had never allowed herself to feel. Silk tapestries in deep blues and silver adorned the stone walls, their intricate patterns catching the light from crystals that glowed with their own inner fire. The bed was large enough for 4 people, draped in fabrics so soft they looked like captured moonlight, And everywhere she looked there were luxuries she had only glimpsed from a distance while scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots. "This can't be for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the spacious chamber. "There's been some mistake." But the guards who had escorted her here, respectfully she realized with growing confusion, not like prisoner handlers but like protectors, simply bowed and withdrew, leaving her alone with opulence that felt as foreign as breathing underwater. She was afraid to touch anything, afraid that her rough servant's hands would somehow contaminate the beauty around her. Through the tall windows that looked out over the ceremonial gardens, she could see Fenris positioning himself like a sentinel outside her door. The war-beast had not left her side since the impossible recognition in the arena, and even now she could feel his protective presence like a warm weight against her consciousness. It should have been terrifying, having a creature of such legendary power devoted to her protection, but instead it felt like the first safety she had known in 20 years. A soft knock at the door made her jump, her heart racing as she called permission to enter. She expected perhaps a servant with food, or one of the guards with instructions about her confinement. Instead, a woman she had never seen before stepped into the chamber with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to luxury. "My lady," the woman said, offering a respectful curtsy that made Lyra's world tilt again. Nobody had ever called her my lady before. Nobody had ever curtsied to her. "I am Meredith, assigned to assist you with your needs during your stay." Lyra stared at the woman in bewilderment, taking in her fine dress, her carefully arranged hair, the way she held herself with the dignity of someone whose service was an honour rather than a burden. "I don't understand. I don't need assistance. I'm used to taking care of myself." Meredith's smile was gentle but determined as she moved toward the wardrobe and began selecting garments that looked like they cost more than Lyra had ever seen in her life. "Perhaps, my lady, but circumstances have changed. Elder Morrigan has requested that you be prepared for the possibility that, well, that everything you believed about your station may have been incorrect." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each one chipping away at the foundation of identity she had built over 20 years of learning to be invisible. She sank onto the edge of the impossible bed, her hands shaking as she stared at the luxury surrounding her. "This is madness. I'm nobody. I've always been nobody." "Have you?" Meredith's question echoed Elder Morrigan's words from the arena, and Lyra felt tears threaten as the careful walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. "Tell me, my lady, do you remember being particularly ill as a child? Fevers that lasted for weeks, times when your foster mother seemed terrified you might die?" The memories rushed back with painful clarity. Endless nights of burning fever, strange dreams filled with silver light, and voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize. Her foster mother's frightened whispers about suppressing what shouldn't be suppressed. "How do you know about that?" "Because suppressing royal bloodline magic takes a terrible toll on a young body," Meredith said softly. "The spells required to hide your true nature from supernatural detection would have nearly killed you several times over. Your foster mother must have loved you very much to maintain such dangerous magic for so many years." Lyra's breath caught as another piece of the impossible puzzle clicked into place. The woman who had raised her, who had claimed to take her in out of pity, had actually been protecting her at tremendous personal cost. Every fever, every brush with death had been the price of keeping her hidden from whatever forces had destroyed the royal family 20 years ago. "She never said anything," Lyra whispered. "Even when she was dying, she never told me the truth." "Because telling you would have made the magic fail," Meredith explained, as she laid out a gown of deep forest green that looked like it had been woven from captured starlight. "The suppression spells required you to believe completely in your own worthlessness. Any doubt, any hope that you might be more than what you appeared, would have shattered the concealment and left you vulnerable to whoever ordered the royal family's destruction." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Everything that had made Lyra's life a misery, the constant reminders of her worthlessness, the careful lessons in invisibility, the crushing of any dream or aspiration, had actually been protection. Her foster mother hadn't been cruel. She had been terrified of losing the child she had sacrificed everything to save. "But the magic is failing now," she said, understanding beginning to dawn. "That's why Fenris could recognize me. That's why everything is changing." Meredith nodded with satisfaction, as if Lyra was finally asking the right questions. Suppression magic weakens as you reach full maturity. By your 20th year, it becomes nearly impossible to maintain. Your foster mother died when she did, because the effort of holding the spells was literally consuming her life force. The weight of sacrifice crashed over Lyra like a tide, leaving her gasping with grief and gratitude and a terror so profound it felt like drowning. Someone had loved her enough to die protecting her. Someone had seen worth in her when she couldn't see it in herself. And now that protection was crumbling, leaving her exposed to dangers she couldn't even imagine. A commotion outside her window drew her attention, and through the crystal-clear glass she could see Lady Seraphina approaching with a group of her supporters, their voices raised in animated discussion. Even from a distance, the fury in Seraphina's emerald eyes was unmistakable, and Lyra felt ice flood her veins as she recognized the expression of someone whose entire world had been stolen. "She's coming here," Lyra breathed, terror making her voice shake. She's going to discover that Fenris will not allow anyone to approach you with hostile intent," Meredith said calmly, continuing her preparations as if mortal danger was of no particular concern. "The ancient guardian has recognized you, my lady. His protection is absolute." As if summoned by their conversation, a low growl rumbled from outside the door. Not threatening exactly, but a clear warning that Fenris was aware of the approaching hostility and would not tolerate any threat to his chosen charge. The sound was followed immediately by raised voices, then sudden silence, then the rapid sound of retreating footsteps. "She'll try again," Lyra said with certainty, born of 20 years surviving in a world that wanted to crush her. "People like her don't give up when they want something. They just find more creative ways to take it." "Perhaps," Meredith agreed as she held up the forest green gown for Lyra's inspection. "But you are no longer alone and defenceless. You have a guardian whose loyalty is legendary, a king who is beginning to see you clearly, and a bloodline that carries power you are only beginning to understand." Lyra stared at her reflection in the polished mirror Meredith had positioned nearby, searching for signs of the royalty everyone claimed to see. Her grey eyes looked the same as always, her unremarkable features unchanged by the impossible revelations of the day. But something was different, a spark of defiance that hadn't been there before, a straightening of her shoulders that spoke of strength she was only beginning to discover. For 20 years she had survived by learning to be invisible, but invisibility was a luxury she could no longer afford. In 3 days, ancient magic would reveal whether she truly carried royal blood, and if she did, every enemy who had thought her safely dead would emerge from the shadows seeking to finish what they had started. The girl who had scrubbed blood from stones was gone forever. What remained was either a princess reclaiming her birthright, or a pretender who would be destroyed for daring to dream above her station. But for the first time in her life, she was not facing that uncertainty alone. The ancient archives beneath the palace had not been disturbed in decades, their silence broken only by the whisper of parchment and the scratch of Theron's pen as he worked through genealogies that predated his empire. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as he spread scroll after scroll across the massive oak table, his silver eyes scanning lineages and bloodline records with the methodical precision of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. He had been here since before dawn, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything except the impossible girl who had turned his world upside down with nothing more than her presence. Every instinct he possessed as an alpha screamed that Lyra was significant beyond measure, but his rational mind struggled to accept what his supernatural senses insisted was true: the royal house of Silvermoon. The genealogy spread before him like a map of power that had shaped 7 territories for 3 centuries. Kings and queens whose bloodline magic had bent the very fabric of reality to their will, whose supernatural authority had been absolute until the night everything changed, 20 years ago, the Great Betrayal. Theron's hand trembled slightly as he traced the family tree to its final tragic conclusion. King Aldric the Just and Queen Isabel the Fair murdered in their beds by trusted advisers who had sold their souls to enemies in the Eastern Territories. Their 3 children, Prince Marcus, age 16, Princess Celeste, age 14, and the baby, Princess Lysandra, barely 6 months old, all declared dead in the flames that consumed the royal wing of the palace, except the baby's body had never been found. The official reports claimed the fire had consumed everything, leaving nothing but ash and twisted metal where the nursery had stood. But now, staring at the detailed description preserved in the royal records, Theron felt ice forming in his veins as pieces of an impossible puzzle began to lock into place. Princess Lysandra, born under the full moon of the winter solstice, hair like spun silver, eyes the colour of storm clouds, a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her left shoulder, visible only under the light of supernatural magic, the rightful heir to a throne that had stood empty for 2 decades while he ruled as regent, waiting for a bloodline successor who everyone believed was dead, silver-flecked eyes, grey like storm clouds, the exact age she would be now if she had somehow survived the massacre that destroyed her family. "Impossible," he whispered, but the word felt hollow even as he spoke it. Fenris had never lied to him, never been wrong about anything that mattered. The ancient guardian's supernatural instincts were tied to magic older than written law, bonds that recognized truth even when rational minds rejected it. His beta Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral despite the early hour and his alpha's obvious distress. "The council requests an audience, my lord. The visiting alphas are concerned about the delay in resolving the succession crisis." Theron's laugh held no humour as he gestured toward the genealogies spread across the table. "Succession crisis, as if the solution hasn't been staring us in the face since the moment Fenris made his choice." He looked up at his most trusted adviser, seeing his own confusion reflected in Marcus's worried expression. "Tell me, old friend, what do you know about suppression magic?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving instinctively toward the weapon at his side as if preparing for threats he couldn't identify. Ancient magic used to hide supernatural signatures from detection, illegal in most territories because of the cost in life force required to maintain it. His eyes narrowed with understanding. "You think the servant girl has been concealed?" "I think," Theron said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that could reshape their entire world, "that we may have been harbouring the rightful queen of the Northern Territories in our own kitchens for the past 20 years. The implications crashed over Marcus like a physical blow, and Theron watched his beta's face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally a dawning comprehension that made his knees buckle. The lost princess, but that would mean the betrothal contracts with Lady Seraphina would be void, Theron finished, surprised by the relief that flooded through him at the thought. The political marriage had been negotiated out of necessity, an alliance forged to prevent war between territories. But if Lyra truly carried royal blood, if she was the heir the kingdom had been waiting for, then every obligation that bound him to Seraphina's family would crumble like sand. A different kind of tension coiled in his chest as he thought of the girl currently hidden away under Fenris's protection. The way her grey eyes had widened with terror, and something else when he approached, the impossible pull he felt toward her that had nothing to do with political convenience and everything to do with a recognition that sang in his blood. "The mate bond," Marcus said quietly, reading his alpha's thoughts with the accuracy of 20 years' friendship. "You feel it too." Theron couldn't deny what his supernatural instincts were screaming with increasing urgency. Every moment he spent away from Lyra felt like torture, like a golden thread stretched thin between them that ached with the need for completion. It made no sense. She was a servant, or had been until yesterday. But mate bonds didn't care about social hierarchy or political convenience. They recognized souls that belonged together across lifetimes, connections that transcended every rational consideration. "She's terrified of me," he admitted, the words tasting like failure in his mouth. 20 years of believing herself worthless, and then I appear like some conquering monster ready to destroy her for daring to exist. "Then perhaps," Marcus suggested carefully, "you should try approaching her as a man rather than as a king. Show her the person behind the crown, the one who sees worth in her that she cannot see in herself." The idea terrified him more than facing an army of enemy alphas. Theron knew how to command, how to conquer, how to inspire fear and respect through displays of overwhelming power. But gentleness, vulnerability, those were luxuries he had never been able to afford in a world where showing weakness meant death. A commotion in the corridor above drew their attention, raised voices and the sound of rapid footsteps that spoke of urgent news. Marcus moved toward the archive's entrance with the fluid grace of a warrior always prepared for conflict. But Theron was already rising from his chair with supernatural senses that told him exactly what was approaching. Danger, directed at Lyra. The golden thread between them pulled taut with her fear, her distress bleeding through their incomplete bond like fire through his veins. She was in trouble, and every instinct he possessed as both alpha and potential mate roared to life with the need to protect, to defend, to destroy whatever threatened what was his. "Ready the guards," he commanded, his voice carrying the lethal authority that had forged an empire. "Someone has made a mistake that will cost them everything." The servant girl who had cleaned blood from stones was under his protection now, whether she understood it or not. And anyone foolish enough to threaten her was about to learn exactly why the Northern Territories had bowed to his will for 15 years. Royal blood or not, mate bond or not, Lyra was his to protect, and he would burn the world to ash before he let anyone harm her. The genealogies lay forgotten on the table as he stalked toward whatever danger dared approach the one creature in 7 territories who could bring him to his knees with nothing more than her presence. The attack came in the darkest hour before dawn, when even the most vigilant guards might be forgiven for believing the world was safe. Lyra jolted awake from dreams filled with silver light and voices speaking in forgotten tongues, her heart hammering against her ribs, as her supernatural senses screamed that something was terribly wrong. The chamber that had felt like sanctuary only hours before now seemed to press in around her like a tomb, shadows writhing in corners where no shadows should exist. The silence was what frightened her most. The palace was never truly quiet. There were always night guards making their rounds, servants preparing for the morning's duties, the distant sounds of a living, breathing stronghold. But now there was nothing except the thundering of her own pulse and a stillness that felt like death holding its breath. A sound like whispered silk came from the direction of the servants' passages. Passages she knew intimately from 20 years of invisible labour. Routes that would allow someone to move through the palace without detection by the main guards. Her blood turned to ice as she realised that her knowledge of those hidden ways was not unique, that others who had once served in these halls might remember them just as clearly. Fenris's warning growl rumbled from outside her door, low and deadly, the sound of a predator who had caught the scent of enemies approaching through the darkness. But there was something different about his tone, an urgency that made her wolf pace frantically inside her chest with recognition of mortal danger. The first assassin came through the wardrobe passage like smoke given form, his face hidden behind dark cloth that left only his eyes visible, eyes that held the cold calculation of someone who killed without conscience or hesitation. The blade in his hand gleamed with an oily sheen that spoke of poison, of death delivered through the smallest scratch. Lyra rolled off the bed just as his knife whistled through the air where her throat had been a heartbeat before, her servant's instincts for survival kicking in with desperate efficiency. But even as she scrambled for safety, more shadows emerged from passages she hadn't even known existed, filling her sanctuary with silent death that moved with professional precision. Fenris's roar of protective fury shattered the unnatural quiet as the ancient guardian's supernatural senses detected the threat to his chosen charge. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as he tore through the chamber door like it was made of paper, his massive frame exploding into the room with lethal grace that transformed him from guardian to avenging angel in the space of a heartbeat. The lead assassin turned toward this new threat, with movements too fluid to be entirely human, his poisoned blade seeking the war beast's heart with the kind of skill that spoke of long practice in murder. But Fenris was legend-made flesh, power and fury given form, and his supernatural speed turned the assassin's expert strike into nothing more than empty air. The sounds of violence that followed were nothing like the clean combat demonstrations Lyra had witnessed in the arena. This was brutal, visceral, the wet sounds of claws meeting flesh and bone, of a guardian whose protective rage had been unleashed on those foolish enough to threaten what he was sworn to defend. She pressed herself against the far wall, terror and awe warring in her chest as she watched Fenris tear through trained killers like they were made of parchment. But her safety was temporary at best. More assassins poured through passages she hadn't even suspected existed, their numbers overwhelming even the war beast's legendary capabilities. And in her terror, as death closed in around her from all sides, something inside Lyra's chest cracked open like an egg. Light exploded from her skin. Not the warm glow of torches or the steady illumination of crystal lamps, but silver radiance that blazed with the intensity of captured moonlight, filling the chamber with supernatural brilliance that sent the remaining assassins stumbling backward with cries of pain and shock. The light poured from every inch of her body, silver fire that responded to her desperate need for protection with power she hadn't known existed. The assassins' agonized screams echoed through the chamber as the radiance burned their eyes, leaving them blind and helpless before Fenris's continued assault. But Lyra barely heard their suffering, lost in the overwhelming sensation of power flowing through her veins like liquid starlight, filling spaces in her soul that she hadn't realized were empty. This was what had been suppressed for 20 years. This was the royal bloodline magic that her foster mother had died protecting, the supernatural heritage that made her worthy of Fenris's recognition and Theron's. The thought of the Alpha King sent another surge of silver light cascading from her skin, and she felt something golden and warm unfurling in her chest, a connection that transcended physical distance and spoke of bonds deeper than blood. He was coming. She could feel him approaching through corridors and stairways with supernatural speed, his protective fury matching Fenris's own as he raced toward the threat to his what? The question dissolved in another wave of power as consciousness began to slip away from her, the magical awakening demanding more energy than her inexperienced body could safely provide. She felt herself falling, silver light flickering like a dying candle, but somehow she wasn't afraid. Fenris was there, his massive form a wall between her and any remaining danger, and beyond him she could sense another presence approaching with lethal intent toward anyone who dared harm her. Theron's roar of fury shook the very foundations of the palace as he burst through what remained of the chamber door, his silver eyes blazing with supernatural rage as he took in the scene before him. The bodies of assassins torn apart by Fenris's protective fury, the war beast standing guard over Lyra's unconscious form, and the lingering traces of silver light that spoke of royal magic awakened through desperate need. Who sent them? His voice carried the promise of retribution that would span generations. the kind of wrath that started wars and ended bloodlines. The single surviving assassin, blinded and broken but still breathing, cowered against the far wall as the Alpha King's attention fixed on him with lethal focus. But before the man could answer, before confessions could be extracted or vengeance properly planned, Lyra stirred in Fenris's protective shadow. Her grey eyes opened slowly, still flickering with residual silver light, and when her gaze met Theron's across the destroyed chamber, something clicked into place between them that had nothing to do with royal bloodlines or political necessity. The mate bond snapped into existence like a physical force, golden threads of connection blazing between them with such intensity that both of them gasped aloud. 20 years of suppression magic crumbling, ancient power recognizing its destined partner, souls calling to each other across every barrier that had been built to keep them apart. In that moment, looking into Theron's silver eyes across a room filled with the evidence of how far enemies would go to destroy her, Lyra finally understood what Elder Morrigan had seen, what Fenris had recognized, what her own heart had been trying to tell her since the moment the war beast first bowed before her. She was no longer the invisible servant who cleaned blood from stones. She was the lost princess whose awakening power had just painted the walls with silver light, and the woman whose mate had come running through the darkness to save her from death itself. The girl who had survived by learning to be nothing was gone forever. What remained was a queen in the making, and she was no longer facing the world alone. The golden threads that bound them together pulsed with each heartbeat, visible to supernatural senses as streams of pure light that connected soul to soul despite every rational argument against their existence. Lyra could feel Theron's presence in her blood now, a warm weight that anchored her to consciousness, even as her awakened magic threatened to drain every ounce of strength from her inexperienced body. She lay in the ruins of what had once been her sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of violence and death. But all she could focus on was the impossible sensation of completeness that filled the hollow spaces in her chest she hadn't known existed. The mate bond hummed between them like a living thing, carrying emotions and sensations that belonged to him. His relief at finding her alive, his fury at the enemies who had dared threaten her, his confusion and growing wonder at the connection that defied every law of their carefully ordered world. "Impossible," she whispered, but the word felt hollow even as she spoke it. Nothing about the past 3 days had followed the rules she thought governed reality. Why should this be any different? Theron knelt beside her with movements that seemed torn between the commanding authority of an Alpha King and the desperate tenderness of a man who had nearly lost something precious beyond measure. His silver eyes searched her face for signs of injury, for evidence that the awakened magic had taken more from her than she could afford to lose. "Are you hurt?" The question came out rougher than he had intended, his voice carrying undertones of the wolf that paced restlessly beneath his human exterior. "The light that came from you, I felt it through the palace walls. Power like that shouldn't be possible for someone untrained." Lyra tried to sit up and immediately regretted the decision, as her head spun with residual magical exhaustion. But before she could fall back against the stone floor, Theron's hands were there to steady her, his touch sending cascades of warmth through the golden connection that bound them together. The sensation was overwhelming, not just physical contact, but emotional intimacy that left her feeling exposed and cherished in equal measure. "I don't understand any of this," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the sound of guards dealing with the aftermath of violence in the corridor beyond. 3 days ago I was scrubbing blood from stones. Now there's light pouring from my skin, and I can feel your emotions like they belong to me." Theron's expression softened with something that might have been wonder as his thumb traced the curve of her cheek, testing the reality of her presence against the terror of almost losing her. "The mate bond, it's ancient magic, older than kingdoms or political alliances. When it activates, it connects souls that were meant to find each other across lifetimes." "But your promise to Lady Seraphina," Lyra said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. The betrothal contracts, the territorial alliances, breaking those would mean war. Would it? Theron's smile held no humour as he helped her to her feet, his hands never leaving her, as if physical contact was the only thing keeping the golden threads between them from snapping under the weight of political reality. Political marriages can be dissolved when circumstances change, and if Elder Morrigan is correct about your bloodline, if you truly carry royal blood, then every obligation that bound me to Seraphina's family becomes null and void. The implications crashed over Lyra like a tide, leaving her gasping with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. If she was truly the lost princess, then she outranked every noble in 7 territories. More than that, she was the rightful heir to a throne that had stood empty for 20 years while Theron ruled as regent, waiting for a successor who everyone believed was dead. "You could be free," she breathed, and felt his emotions spike through their connection. Hope and desire, and a longing so fierce it made her knees weak. "We could be free," he corrected, his silver eyes blazing with intensity that made the air between them shimmer with supernatural heat. The mate bond doesn't recognise political convenience or social hierarchy. It sees souls that belong together, and everything else is just obstacles to be overcome. Fenris's protective growl rumbled from the doorway where he had positioned himself as sentinel, his golden eyes watching the corridor for signs of additional threats. But there was something different about his stance now, a satisfaction that spoke of duties being fulfilled in ways that transcended mere protection. He had brought his charges together despite every barrier that should have kept them apart, and the ancient magic that bound him to the royal bloodline sang with completion. "The families that sent the assassins," Lyra said, her voice growing stronger as anger began to burn through the exhaustion that threatened to claim her. "They know who I am. They've always known, haven't they?" Theron's expression darkened with the kind of fury that had forged an empire through conquest and fear. "Some of them, certainly. The coup 20 years ago wasn't random violence. It was a coordinated attempt to eliminate the royal bloodline permanently. When your body wasn't found in the ruins, they must have spent years searching, waiting for the suppression magic to weaken enough that they could locate and finish what they started." The weight of generational hatred settled over Lyra like a shroud, but instead of the crushing terror she might have felt 3 days ago, she discovered something new burning in her chest: defiance. They had murdered her family, scattered her people, forced her to live 20 years in servitude and invisibility. But they had failed to break her, and now she was no longer alone. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The golden threads connecting her to Theron pulsed with shared determination, with a unity of purpose that transcended individual desires. "Now we stop running from the truth," Theron said, his voice carrying the authority that had bent 7 territories to his will. "Tomorrow night, when the moon reaches its full strength, we perform the ancient recognition ceremony. If your blood is truly royal, the magic will prove it beyond any doubt." "And if it's not?" The question escaped before she could stop it, 20 years of learned worthlessness making her doubt even the evidence of her own supernatural awakening. Theron's smile was fierce with possessive certainty as he pulled her closer until she could feel his heartbeat against her chest and see her own reflection in his silver eyes. "Then you're still mine. Royal blood or not, mate bond or not, you belong with me, and I will tear apart anyone who tries to take you away." The declaration sent heat cascading through their connection, desire, and protective fury, and something deeper than love blazing between them like captured lightning. This was what the songs were written about, what kingdoms rose and fell to protect. The kind of bond that transcended politics and social expectations, that looked at impossible circumstances and chose to fight rather than surrender. "The ceremony," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were planning. "Will it hurt?" "Probably," Theron admitted with the honesty of someone who had never lied to spare feelings. Royal recognition magic is intense. It will strip away every concealment, every barrier, everything that has hidden your true nature. But I'll be there with you. We both will. He glanced toward Fenris, whose golden eyes reflected the same fierce protectiveness that blazed in the Alpha King's silver gaze. Guardian and mate united in their determination to see her through whatever trials lay ahead, to help her reclaim the birthright that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what she had lost. Together, Lyra said, and felt the word resonate through the mate bond like a promise, like an oath sworn before witnesses of starlight and ancient magic. Tomorrow night would either prove her royal heritage or destroy her completely in the attempt. But for the first time in 20 years, she was not facing the future alone. The invisible servant who had learned to survive through worthlessness was gone forever, replaced by a woman who carried light in her veins and the heart of a king beating in rhythm with her own. The lost princess was ready to come home.